When ruthless billionaire Vincent Cross collapses during the most important deal of his career, he never expected to wake up in the hands of Dr. Diana Winters, a woman who sees right through his cold exterior to the broken man beneath. What starts as a medical emergency becomes a collision of two damaged souls, each harboring secrets that could destroy them both. Asterisk. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Cross Tower buzzed with nervous energy as Manhattan's skyline glittered beyond floor to ceiling windows. Vincent Cross sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his steel-gray eyes scanning the faces of his opponents like a predator sizing up prey. At 34, he had built an empire that made grown men tremble, and today would be no different. "Gentlemen," Vincent's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You have exactly 60 seconds to accept my offer before I withdraw it permanently." Their company had been Vincent's target for months, and everyone in the room knew that when Vincent Cross wanted something, he usually got it. His reputation preceded him like a shadow, ruthless, calculating, and utterly without mercy in business. Julian Hayes, Vincent's assistant since college, stood silently by the wall, watching his friend with growing concern. Vincent had been pushing himself harder than usual lately, surviving on coffee and determination while closing deal after deal. The man who had once been Julian's roommate and closest confidant had become someone else entirely, a machine built for success at any cost. "This is extortion," Harrison's CEO stammered, his hands shaking as he reviewed the acquisition terms. Vincent's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. "This is business. You're hemorrhaging money, your stock is worthless, and your patents will be obsolete within 6 months. I'm offering you a lifeline, but my generosity has limits." He stood abruptly, his tall frame commanding the room's attention. At 6'3" with dark hair perfectly styled and a suit that cost more than most people's cars, Vincent Cross was the picture of power and control. But Julian noticed something others missed: the slight tremor in Vincent's hands, the pale sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. 30 seconds, Vincent announced, checking his platinum watch. Heart was racing, but not from excitement. Something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. The familiar tightness in his chest that he'd been ignoring for weeks was becoming impossible to dismiss. The Harrison executives huddled together, whispering frantically. Vincent turned toward the window, one hand pressed subtly against his chest. The city sprawled below him like a conquered kingdom, but for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. "Mr. Cross," Harrison's CFO began, "we need more time to consider time's up." Vincent's voice came out strained, barely controlled. He spun around to face them, and the room seemed to tilt sideways. The crushing pain in his chest exploded outward, stealing his breath and sending lightning through his left arm. The world blurred at the edges. Vincent's knees buckled, and he grabbed for the table, his fingers scraping across polished wood as gravity won the battle. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Julian's horrified face and the scatter of papers floating to the floor like snow. "Call 911. Julian's voice cracked as he dropped to his knees beside Vincent's motionless form. Asterisk, Metropolitan General. Hospital's emergency room was a symphony of controlled chaos when the ambulance arrived. Dr. Diana Winters looked up from the chart she was reviewing, green eyes alert as she heard the paramedics report over the radio. She had been working a double shift, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her scrubs bearing the evidence of a particularly difficult day. "Trauma 2, she called to the nurses, already moving toward the ambulance bay. At 29, Diana had seen every kind of emergency the city could produce. The doors flew open, and the paramedics wheeled in their patient. Even unconscious, he radiated an intensity that made the air around him seem charged with electricity. His face was all sharp angles and strong jawlines. It's the kind of masculine beauty that belonged on magazine covers rather than in her emergency room. "What do we have?" she asked, falling into step beside the stretcher as they moved through the corridors. Vincent Cross, 34, collapsed during a business meeting. "Possible me. Vitals stabilizing, but he's been unconscious for 20 minutes. Diana's steps faltered slightly. Vincent Cross. Even she had heard of him, the tech mogul whose hostile takeovers made front-page news. His personal life was shrouded in mystery, and whose business rivals whispered that he had ice water in his veins instead of blood. Yet here, he was looking younger and more vulnerable than any newspaper photo had ever captured. "Get me a 12-lead EKG and draw a full cardiac panel," she ordered as they transferred him to the examination table. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, checking his pupils, listening to his heart, cataloging every detail of his condition. That's when she noticed it. The irregular rhythm beneath her stethoscope, the subtle signs that spoke of a heart. Under tremendous strain, this wasn't just exhaustion or stress. Vincent Cross was hiding something that could kill him. "Doctor?" The nurse looked at her expectantly. Diana's hand stilled on Vincent's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She had taken an oath to heal, to protect, to save lives regardless of who lay on her table. But she had also read the newspapers, seen the interviews where Vincent Cross spoke with casual cruelty about destroying his competitors. Yet looking at him now, she saw something else entirely. In his unconscious state, the harsh lines of the face had softened, dark lashes rested against pale cheeks, and his lips, normally set in a firm line of control, were slightly parted like a child's. Whatever monster the media had painted him to be, right now he was just a man whose heart was failing him. The monitor's steady beeping filled the silence as Diana made her decision. She would save him first, judge him later. 3 hours into surgery, Vincent's eyes fluttered open to find himself staring at sterile white ceiling tiles. The first thing he noticed was the absence of pain, replaced by a floating sensation that told him he was heavily medicated. The second thing he noticed was the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed. She was beautiful in an understated way, with intelligent green eyes and auburn hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. But there was something in her expression that made him instantly wary. She was studying him like a specimen under a microscope. "You're awake," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested too much coffee and not enough sleep. "I'm Dr. Winters. You had a heart attack, Mr. Cross, a significant one. There's a deal, the only deal you need to worry about, right? Now is the one you're making with mortality." Diana's tone was crisp, professional, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Anger, maybe, or disappointment. "Your heart has sustained damage. Without immediate lifestyle changes and ongoing treatment, you're looking at another episode within 6 months, possibly fatal." Vincent's steel-gray eyes fixed on her with laser intensity. Even drugged and helpless, he radiated the kind of commanding presence that made people step aside on sidewalks. But Diana didn't flinch. "You don't know me," he said, his voice hoarse but gaining strength. "I don't do lifestyle changes. I do whatever it takes to win. How's that working out for you?" Diana shot back, gesturing to the monitors surrounding his bed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're losing the only game that actually matters." 2 weeks later, Vincent found himself in the most foreign environment imaginable. Diana's modest apartment in Brooklyn, learning to cook something that didn't come from a 5-star restaurant or his assistant's takeout runs. The forced medical leave had been Julian's idea, but Diana had been the one to suggest he needed to understand how normal people lived if he wanted his heart to survive the next decade. "You're burning the onions," Diana said from her position at the kitchen island, where she was supposedly grading medical charts, but was actually watching him with barely concealed amusement. "I don't burn things," Vincent muttered, stirring the pan with more aggression than the recipe required. "I execute strategies with precision." "Right, and how's that strategy working for the chicken?" Vincent glanced down to see smoke rising from the other burner. He moved with surprising speed for someone still recovering from cardiac surgery. But Diana was faster, sliding past him to rescue dinner. The brief contact sent an electric shock through both of them that had nothing to do with the stove. "No," she said, not stepping away even though the crisis was averted. "For someone who supposedly conquers entire industries, you're remarkably helpless in a kitchen." "I've never needed to cook." Vincent's voice had dropped to something dangerously close to a whisper. I've never needed to do a lot of things that normal people do. There was something in his tone that made Diana look up at him sharply. The warm light of her small kitchen, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of his armor of expensive suits, Vincent looked almost human, almost approachable. "What kind of childhood doesn't include learning basic life skills?" she asked. Genuine curiosity replacing her usual defensive sarcasm. Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The kind where you're too busy surviving to worry about anything else." Before Diana could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID, and her face went pale. "I have to take this," she said, stepping into the living room. "No." Couldn't hear the words, but her tone grew increasingly agitated. When she returned 5 minutes later, her hands were shaking. "Everything okay?" Vincent asked, surprised by his own concern. Diana forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just hospital politics. Nothing I can't handle." But Vincent had built his empire by reading people's tells. And Diana's body language screamed that, whatever that call had been about, she was terrified. More than terrified. She was trapped. Diana. He stepped closer, close enough to catch. The scent of her shampoo mixed with the antiseptic smell that seemed permanently attached to her skin. What's really going on? For a moment, her carefully constructed walls wavered. Vincent saw exhaustion in her green eyes, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. It was a look he recognized in his own mirror. "Why do you care?" she whispered. The question hung between them like a challenge. Vincent could have given her a dozen different answers, all of them safe, all of them lies. Instead, he reached out and touched her face with fingers that trembled slightly from more than just his recent medical trauma. "Because," he said, his voice rough with honesty, "you're the first person in years who's looked at me like I'm worth saving." Diana's breath caught. She should step away, maintain professional boundaries, remember that Vincent Cross was everything. She'd spent her career fighting against privilege without conscience, power without responsibility. But standing in her kitchen with dinner burning on the stove and her entire world threatening to collapse around her, all she could see was the man who'd been learning to cook because she'd asked him to. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, the kiss of two people who'd spent too long denying themselves any kind of human connection. Diana melted into him, her hands fisting in his sweater as she kissed him back with equal fervor. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together as the reality of what they'd just done settled between them. "This is a mistake," Diana whispered. Probably Vincent agreed, but he didn't step away. "I'm not the kind of woman who falls for billionaires with commitment issues. And I'm not the kind of man who falls at all." Diana's phone rang again. This time, Vincent could see the caller ID over her shoulder. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, Chief of Staff. Diana's face went white as she answered. Dr. Winters Hawthorne's voice was cold enough to hear from across the room. "I believe we need to discuss your recent patient care decisions. My office. First thing Monday morning?" The call ended, and Diana sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "Diana, what's happening?" Vincent demanded. She looked up at him with eyes full of a pain that had nothing to do with their complicated situation. "Dr. Hawthorne is the Chief of Staff at Metropolitan General. He's also the man who killed my sister. Explain." Vincent's voice carried the steel that had intimidated boardrooms full of executives. But Diana was beyond intimidation now. She stood at her apartment window, looking out at the Brooklyn skyline as if the lights could somehow provide answers to questions she'd been carrying. "For 3 years, my sister Emma was a nurse at Metropolitan General. She discovered that Dr. Hawthorne was altering medication records, skimming expensive drugs to sell on the black market. When she tried to report him, he destroyed her career, her reputation, everything." Vincent moved closer, his business instincts already calculating angles and leverage points. "What happened to her?" "She killed herself." Diana's voice was barely above a whisper. 6 months after he fired her and made sure no other hospital in the city would hire her, I found her in her apartment with an empty bottle of pills and a note apologizing for being too weak to fight back. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Vincent understood now why Diana had seemed so familiar with carrying impossible burdens, why she looked at him with such wariness despite their growing connection. "So you became a doctor to get close to him?" Vincent said. It wasn't a question. Got into medical school the year after she died, spent 3 years at the top of my class, did my residency at the best program I could find. Also, I could come back to Metropolitan General and gather evidence against the man who destroyed her. Diana finally turned to face him. For 3 years, he's been untouchable. Too well-connected, too careful, too protected by hospital politics. Vincent's mind was already racing through possibilities. What changed? Why is he calling you? Now. Diana's smile was bitter. You changed things, Vincent. When I saved your life, when I put you in the cardiac unit, instead of letting you die quietly in the ER, I attracted attention. Important patient, successful surgery, media coverage. Suddenly everyone knows who Dr. Diana Winters is. Hawthorne sees you as a threat. He sees me as Emma's sister, who's gotten too close to power. He's going to destroy me the same way he destroyed her, unless... Diana stopped, her expression shifting to something Vincent couldn't read. Unless what? Unless I can give him something. He wants more than my destruction. Diana's green eyes met his with devastating clarity. He's been trying to get funding for a new cardiac wing. Guess whose foundation has been considering a $50 million donation to Metropolitan General? Vincent felt the world tilt on its axis as understanding hit him. You're using me. I was. Diana's honesty was like a blade between his ribs. From the moment I saw your name on that stretcher, I saw an opportunity. Save the famous Vincent Cross, earn his gratitude, maybe even his affection, and then leverage that connection to finally get justice for Emma. The betrayal cut deeper than Vincent had thought possible. He'd built walls around his heart precisely to avoid this kind of vulnerability. Diana had found every crack in his defenses. So everything between us, he said, his voice dangerously, quiet, the cooking lessons, the conversations, the kiss, ... It was all part of your plan. It started that way. Diana took a step toward him, her eyes desperate. But Vincent, what I feel for you now is real. The connection between us is real. I never expected to actually love me. Vincent's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Don't you dare try to make this about love when you've been playing me from the beginning. He moved toward the door, but Diana stepped into his path. Vincent, please, let me explain. Let me tell you about Emma, about what Hawthorne did to her, about why I had no choice, you had a choice. Vincent's steel gray eyes were cold as winter morning. You chose revenge over honesty. You chose manipulation over trust. And you know what the worst part is, Diana? I would have helped you anyway. The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back as Vincent continued, his voice gaining strength with each syllable. If you'd told me the truth, if you'd asked for help instead of deciding to use me, I would have moved heaven and earth to destroy Hawthorne for what he did to your sister. But you didn't trust me enough to try honesty. You saw a mark instead of a man. Vincent reached the door but paused with his hand on the handle. When he turned back, his expression was the same one Diana had seen in newspaper photos. Cold. Calculating, utterly without mercy. Consider our arrangement terminated, Dr. Winters. And when Hawthorne destroys your career, remember that you had an ally who would have fought beside you. Instead, you chose to fight alone. The door closed behind him with surgical precision, leaving Diana standing in her empty apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of the only real connection she'd felt since. Emma died. But as Vincent's footsteps faded down the hallway, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street, or the camera with the telephoto lens that had been documenting their entire relationship. Dr. Richard Hawthorne smiled as he reviewed the photographs on his phone. Vincent Cross and Diana Winters, cooking together, kissing, looking like lovers instead of doctor and patient. By tomorrow morning, these images would be on the desk of the medical board's ethics committee, along with a detailed report about Dr. Winters' inappropriate relationship with a patient, just like Emma. Diana had gotten too close to something that could hurt him, and just like Emma, she was about to learn that some games were too dangerous for amateurs to play. Vincent Cross, had built his empire on the principle that information was power. But the call from Julian at 6 in the morning proved that some information came with a price too high to calculate. "They're destroying her." Julian's voice was tight with urgency over the phone. Hawthorne leaked photos to the medical board, claiming Diana violated ethics by having a relationship with a patient. "The hearing is this morning, and word is they're going to strip her license." Vincent stood in his penthouse office, looking out at the city he'd conquered while his chest tightened with something that had nothing to do with his recent cardiac event. He'd spent the past week convincing himself that Diana's betrayal had killed whatever feelings he'd developed for her. But hearing about her impending destruction made him realize the truth. He was still completely in love with the woman who'd saved his life and broken his heart in equal measure. "There's more," Julian continued. "I did some digging into Dr. Hawthorne, like you asked. Vincent, the man is dirty in ways that would make our worst corporate raiders look like saints. Diana was right about the drug trafficking, but it goes deeper. Missing medication, altered patient records, at least 3 suspicious deaths in the cardiac unit over the past 5 years." Vincent closed his eyes, remembering Diana's face when she'd told him about her sister, the pain that had radiated from her like heat from a wound. She'd been carrying that burden alone for 3 years, and when she'd finally found someone with the power to help her, she'd been too damaged to trust him with the truth. "Where's the hearing?" Vincent asked. "Metropolitan General Conference. Room B, starting in an hour." "Vincent, what are you going to do?" Vincent was already reaching for his jacket, his mind calculating angles and strategies with the precision that had made him legendary in business circles. "I'm going to do what I should have done the moment Diana told me about Emma. I'm going to destroy Richard Hawthorne." The medical board hearing was exactly as sterile and intimidating as Hawthorne had intended. Diana sat at a small table facing 5 stern-faced doctors, her medical license and career hanging in the balance. She'd known this moment would come. Eventually, she'd just hoped to take Hawthorne down with her. "Dr. Winters," the board chairman began, "these photographs clearly show you engaged in a romantic relationship with a patient under your care. Can you explain this violation of medical ethics?" Before Diana could answer, the conference room doors burst open with the kind of dramatic flair that only Vincent Cross could manage. He strode in wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, followed by Julian carrying a briefcase that looked expensive enough to fund a small country. "Gentlemen," Vincent said, his voice carrying the authority that had made Fortune 500 CEOs surrender without a fight, "I'm afraid you're operating under false information." Dr. Hawthorne, who had been sitting in the observer section with barely concealed smugness, went pale. "Mr. Cross, this is a closed medical board hearing. You have no authority here." Vincent's smile was sharp enough to perform surgery. "Actually, Dr. Hawthorne, as the largest private donor to Metropolitan General Hospital, I have more authority here than you think, and as the subject of these supposed ethical violations, I have the right to set the record straight." He moved to the front of the room with predatory grace, every eye in the room following his movement. Diana watched in stunned silence as the man she'd thought she'd lost forever positioned himself between her and destruction. "The photographs you've been shown," Vincent continued, "were taken during a series of cooking lessons that Dr. Winters provided as part of my cardiac rehabilitation. As anyone who's spent 5 minutes with me can tell you, I'm spectacularly incompetent in domestic situations. Dr. Winters was teaching me basic life skills that my cardiologist insisted were necessary for my recovery." "And the kiss?" the board chairman asked, holding up one of the photographs. Vincent's expression didn't change, but Diana caught the slight tightening around his eyes. The kiss was the action of a man who was grateful to be alive, taken during a moment when I forgot professional boundaries. Dr. Winters immediately corrected my behavior and maintained appropriate distance thereafter. If anyone violated ethical standards, it was me, not her. The room was silent except for the sound of Hawthorne's increasingly labored breathing. Vincent turned his attention to the chief of staff with the focused intensity of a laser. "But we're not really here to discuss my behavior, are we, Dr. Hawthorne? We're here because you're terrified that Dr. Winters has gotten too close to the truth about your illegal activities. Just like her sister Emma got too close 3 years ago." Hawthorne stood abruptly. I don't have to listen to these accusations. Actually, you do? Julian stepped forward, opening his briefcase to reveal stacks of documents. Because we have bank records showing your offshore accounts. Testimony from 3 former employees who witnessed your drug trafficking operation and security. Footage from the hospital pharmacy showing you personally removing controlled substances. Vincent's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but every person in the room heard it clearly. We also have Emma Winter's personal journal, which she kept hidden in her apartment for the 6 months before she died. Very detailed. Notes about your operation, Dr. Hawthorne. Very incriminating notes. Diana's breath caught. She'd searched Emma's apartment a dozen times after her death, looking for something, anything that might serve as evidence. That's impossible. There was no journal. There was, Vincent said, still watching Hawthorne with predatory focus. Your sister was smarter than anyone gave her credit for. She hid it in a place she knew only you would think to look, but you were too grief-stricken to search properly. He nodded to Julian, who produced a small leather-bound book. She hollowed out your medical school textbook on cardiac pharmacology, the one you kept on your bookshelf as a memorial. Adana's hands flew to her mouth as understanding hit her. Emma had known she might not survive her fight against Hawthorne, so she'd left evidence in the one place Diana would eventually find it, hidden in the pages of the book that had launched her sister's own medical dreams. Hawthorne was backing toward the door, his face gray with panic. You can't prove anything. I'll fight this. I have connections, resources, had Vincent corrected, past tense. Because as of this morning, your medical license has been suspended, pending investigation. Your accounts have been frozen by federal authorities and your connections have mysteriously developed amnesia about ever knowing you. The chief of staff's career, reputation, freedom crumbled around him like a house of cards, just as Emma's had 3 years earlier. The poetic justice was perfect, but Vincent wasn't finished. Dr. Winters, he said, turning to face Diana. For the first time since entering the room, you've been cleared of all charges. The board has also voted to offer you the position of Chief of Emergency Medicine, effective immediately. Diana stared at him in disbelief. Vincent, I can't accept that, not when I... When you what? Saved my life? Tried to get justice for your sister? Fell in love with a man too damaged to recognize it when it was offered freely? Vincent's steel-gray eyes softened slightly. Diana, you were wrong about one thing. You said you had no choice but to use me. But you did have a choice. You could have trusted me. The room had emptied around them. The medical board having retreated to process the revelations about Hawthorne, Julian having discreetly stepped outside. Diana and Vincent stood alone in the sterile conference room that had nearly witnessed the end of her career. I'm sorry, Diana whispered. I'm so sorry, Vincent. I wanted to tell you the truth, but I was terrified that you'd walk away if you knew what I was really after. Instead, you made sure I'd walk away by lying to me. Vincent's voice held no anger now, only exhaustion. Diana, I would have moved heaven and earth to help you get justice for Emma. I would have used every resource at my disposal. It's called in every favor, destroyed every obstacle in your path. All you had to do was ask. I know that now. Right. Diana took a tentative step toward him. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I know I don't have the right to ask for another chance. But Vincent, what I feel for you is real. What we had together, even if it started as manipulation, became something genuine, something I've never felt before. Vincent studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing every detail. Finally spoke. His words were soft, but final. I believe you, Diana. I believe that you love me, and I believe that what we had was real. But love isn't enough if there's no trust to build it on. He moved toward the door, pausing only when Diana called his name one last time. Vincent, wait. What happens now? He turned back to her, and Diana saw something in his expression that looked almost like peace. Now you save lives, Diana. You run the best emergency department in the city. You honor Emma's memory, and you help people the way you helped me. And maybe someday you'll meet someone who deserves the love you have to give. What about you? Vincent's smile was sad, but genuine. I'm going to learn to cook without burning down the kitchen. I'm going to take care of my heart, literal and metaphorical. And I'm going to remember that sometimes the most important victory is knowing when to walk away. He left her standing in the empty conference room, surrounded by the wreckage and renewal of her entire life. Diana had gotten her justice, her career, and her chance to honor Emma's memory. She'd lost the only man she'd ever loved, but she'd gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that she was strong enough to survive anything, even her own mistakes. 6 months later, Dr. Diana Winters was featured on the cover of Medical Weekly as the youngest chief of emergency medicine in Metropolitan General's history. The article mentioned her innovative patient care programs, her work with underserved communities, and her dedication to medical ethics reform. It didn't mention that she still kept Vincent Cross's business card in her desk drawer, or that she sometimes found herself cooking the recipes he'd attempted to master in her kitchen. It didn't mention that she'd heard he was doing well, taking better care of himself, even dating someone new. What mattered was that Emma's death had finally meant something, that Hawthorne was serving a federal sentence for his crimes, and that Diana was saving lives every day in her sister's memory. Sometimes justice came at a price too high to calculate, but sometimes, just sometimes, it was worth every penny. The end asterisk. Like this video if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales, and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.